Welcome to New York, 1848. Today is July 19th.
Something pretty important is occurring here today. It is all about women's suffrage. But first, the backstory.
Everyone knows about Martin Luther King and his fight for African American rights. Yet not many people know about women and the struggle for their rights and the convention that started the whole fight.
Remember the Ladies by Abigail Adams in 1776 was a huge event in women's suffrage. Abigail Adams was only known as the wife of John Adams until she felt the need to speak her mind and wrote the Remember the Ladies letter to her husband. Abigail wrote the letter to inform John and his fellow members of Congress how she felt about the Constitution of the United States and how it talked about men having more power than women.
As said in her letter, I long to hear that you have declared an independency. And by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies, and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion, and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation.
Educating women developed slowly with Worcester, Massachusetts, opening the first public high school for girls in 1824. Oberlin became the first college to admit women in 1837 with separate courses, thereby illustrating ambivalence at truly educating women. In 1824, in Boston, Massachusetts, an all-girls high school was opened for them so the girls of Boston could be educated. 13 years later, Oberlin College began to accept women in their program. Although women enrolled at Oberlin, they had to be in separate classes. But still, it was a great opportunity for women to be more educated.
The idea of the convention occurred in London in 1840, when Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, who were attending a meeting of the World Anti-Slavery Society, were denied the opportunity to speak from the floor or to be seated as delegates. Lucretia and Elizabeth left the room where the meeting was taking place and began to discuss the fact that while they were trying to secure rights for enslaved African Americans, American women found themselves treated unequally in many ways.
The Seneca Falls Convention later occurred in 1848. The two main women involved were Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. They led the convention along with Mary Ann McClintock. Elizabeth Cady Stanton opened up the convention with her address speech. In her speech, she had said, "We have met here today to discuss our rights and wrongs, civil and political, and not, as some have supposed, to go into our detail of social life alone. We do not propose to petition the legislator to make our husbands just, generous, and courteous, to see every man at the head of the cradle, and to clothe every woman in male attire."
There were 300 people who showed up to the convention on July 19th and July 20th. 260 of the attendees were women. 40 men also showed up to participate and hear what Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton had to say about women having the same amount of responsibility and rights as men. On July 20th, the last day of the convention, Elizabeth and Lucretia asked all the attendees to sign the Declaration of Sentiments. The Declaration of Sentiments states, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed."
What did women think of men having more rights than them, and what did they do about it? In the words of Professor Ashcraft, "So here's where we were before the convention. So if these ladies come up saying, 'Wait a minute, you said the Declaration of Independence says that all men are created equal,' and they worked on that. So in the Seneca Falls Convention later, they drafted the Declaration of Sentiments, and that's just another version of the Declaration of Independence, except the Declaration of Sentiments states that all men and women are created equal, and so they are in doubt of their Creator for certain inalienable rights. So they're claiming that rights for men have never been really given upon women.
Attitude towards unmarried women was integral in the women's suffrage movement because most of the women in the suffrage were spinsters. So they were objects of derision, not just by the men around them, but by their sisters.
Other big supporters of the women's suffrage movement were Elva Vanderbilt Belmont and Margaret Brown. Margaret and Elva were good friends. Miss Belmont was such a leader in the women's suffrage movement, Margaret moved back east and lived in a rented cottage in Newport, Rhode Island, to be close to Miss Belmont, to assist her in her activities. It was important to be near Washington, D.C. and New York because those were the two epicenters of the suffrage movement. It was also important to be in Chicago because the fight for women's reproductive rights was there.
One of the many opposers was the Oneida Whig newspaper. A line from the newspaper had said, "Having deprived her of this first right of a citizen, the elective franchise, thereby leaving her without representation in the halls of legislation, he has oppressed her on all sides. He has made her, if married, in the eye of law, civilly dead." This line means that having her lacking the right to vote, she doesn't have experience in making laws. He has weighed her down and made her technically dead when it comes to rights.
Since the people who were at the Seneca Falls Convention and all the other men and women who believed in women's rights fought for what they believed in and stood up to the opposers who didn't think that women should have equal rights to men. This fight against the opposers shows that if the Seneca Falls Convention attendees wouldn't have fought for rights for women, they couldn't have gone to school, work, or even church equally.
At the Seneca Falls Convention, many resolutions of what to fight for in the Declaration of Sentiments were made. One of them included that because women are being taxed equally to men, they should have equal rights to men. In the article, Women's Suffrage, they said taxation and representation are inseparable. This was a major issue to fight for, mainly because of the country's past with this issue. During the American Revolution, Americans fought very hard for representation. If they were being taxed, now it was happening all over again except only for women.
The 19th Amendment was passed in 1912, 34 years after the Seneca Falls Convention, which had a huge political impact on U.S. history. The 19th Amendment states, "The right of the citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex." The 19th Amendment allowed women to vote and to be treated equally.
The Seneca Falls Convention affected the social ways of daily life. Degrees earned by women remained between approximately 60 and 62% for associate's degrees, 57 and 58% for bachelor's degrees. Percentages of both master's and doctor's degrees earned by females increased from 1999 to 2000 to 2009 and 2010, from 58 to 60%.
We then asked Professor Ashcraft why the Seneca Falls Convention is downplayed in history.
That's true.
Just like the fight for civil rights at the Seneca Falls Convention in New York on July 19th and 20th in 1848, 260 women and 40 men fought for the responsibility for women to go to work, school, and church equally. They met to approve of women's rights for equality and the right to vote.